everyone, and welcome to Art of Citizenry podcast, where we navigate the complexities of doing good in an unequal world. I am your host and in-house educator, Manpreet Kaur Kalra.
Hello everyone. I want to start this episode by acknowledging that I took a little break from the podcast over the last few weeks to be with and support my community as we advance the fight for social justice, economic justice, and human rights. In episode 10, I did a deep dive into the history surrounding the farmers' protest, especially the Green Revolution. I highly recommend you listen to that episode, but I do want to offer a quick overview of what exactly is going on in India. In September 2020, the Indian government undemocratically passed 3 new agricultural bills that deregulate and privatize India's agricultural industry. They do this by dismantling the minimum support price or subsidies, which provides a minimum income to farmers for some crops. In addition, the bills remove restrictions on the purchase of land by giant corporations, meaning corporations can now freely buy up the land that has been maintained in some families for generations. The bills also remove limits on stockpiling crops, giving corporations the ability to control the demand and price of crops. Since these bills have been passed, and yes, they are already active, hundreds of thousands of small farmers and farm workers across India have led and actively participated in what has been documented as the largest protest in human history. In a country with an autocratic leader who has a history of supporting the mass murder of marginalized communities, dissent is as much a threat to one's individual livelihood as simply existing is. The unfortunate reality is that human rights violations are part of the fabric of India's history. From police brutality to unlawful arrests and disappearances, genocide has become normalized, which is why, if you are a minority, your rights are constantly under threat. As has been the case throughout history, protesters are being painted as terrorists by state-owned news outlets and are being met with government-sanctioned police brutality, tear gas, and water cannons. Citizen journalists are being unlawfully arrested and detained for reporting on police brutality or voicing support for the farmers. The police have attempted to cut off access to food and water at protest sites to starve the protesters away. The internet has been cut off. Social media has been heavily regulated to make communication amongst protesters and access to outside information incredibly difficult. The UN has made it clear that cutting internet connection as a means to stifle dissent is a violation of human rights. Religio-political constructs in India are rooted in Hindu nationalism or religious hegemony and are further amplified by intersections of oppression, including caste and gender. We saw this play out in the case of Nodeep Kaur, a Dalit labor rights activist who was abducted, sexually assaulted, and harassed by the police, a case in which casteism and misogyny collide. For those who are not familiar with the term Dalit, Dalit refers to the lowest caste in India. You might hear people refer to Dalits as untouchables. To further explore this case and the case of Shiv Kumar, a labor rights activist who was abducted and unlawfully held, I'm joined by my dear friend and sister, Dharnamol Kaur. The past few months have brought us together as a form of healing, and I'm so happy to have her join me for this episode. Dharnamol is a community organizer and design researcher at Code for America, working on food access for communities marginalized by the system. One of the most notable cases that we have both spoken about is that of Nodeep Kaur, who was recently released on bail on February 26th after being unlawfully imprisoned for over a month. What many people don't realize is that a fellow activist and friend of Nodeep's named Shiv Kumar, who is also a Dalit rights activist, was himself arrested around the same time as well.
What I know about Shiv Kumar's case is, first of all, folks didn't know where he was. Like, he was abducted for at least 8 to 10 days. His parents, nobody knew where he was. And for that time, the police had held him. And we know Nodeep Kaur has confirmed this, and we know this from many other folks, that he has been continuously tortured.
Shiv Kumar was released last week on bail and has confirmed being tortured at the hands of the police. At this moment, I want to pause for a trigger warning. For the next 30 seconds, I will be reading a quote from Shiv Kumar and his treatment under police custody. After abducting him at gunpoint and putting a cloth over his face, Shiv Kumar recounts, "They drove me to a police station. They removed my clothes, and they beat me up brutally like an animal. My hands were tied. They hit my feet. My toes were bleeding. Then they hit my hands in the same way. Cops would get tired, but the beating wouldn't stop. One of the cops even spit on my face. This is how they tortured me for 3 hours. Then I was asked to walk while my feet bled." Shiv recounts this kind of brutality occurring every day while in prison, at least 3 times a day for a minimum of 1 hour each time. Going back to what Thurnamal was just saying, Shiv Kumar's family was not aware of his unlawful arrest by the police till much later. In fact, photojournalist Vibhu Grover shared Shiv Kumar's story and wrote, "On 16th January, Shiv was illegally detained by Haryana police who didn't inform his friends or family. The very first news of his detention was shared on the 31st of January, after almost 2 weeks. On 24th January, though, some policemen showed up at his home, asked for his mother to tell Shiv to visit the police station, got a few papers signed from her, which she was not able to read, and left, while they had already detained Shiv 8 days ago." I believe it's important to take a moment to recognize that both Nodeep Kaur and Shiv Kumar were abducted for speaking up against the exploitation of factory workers. Their supposed crime was fighting for a fair and equitable society in which all people are treated with respect. They demanded accountability, which is a threat to any exploitative system.
And the wild thing is that he's been arrested, he's been abducted for something that he wasn't even present at. They picked him up for being at a protest that he literally was not even there.
Yes, the allegations against him are outrageous. How is this a democracy? The unfortunate reality of this case is that Shiv Kumar's intersections of oppression make him susceptible to abuse. He is Dalit, living with a disability since he is partially blind, and from an economically disadvantaged background. He needs special glasses to see and wasn't even given access to these while he was imprisoned.
And even Nodeep, now that she recalls what happened to her while she was abducted, she was arrested, she says they said a lot of caste-based things to her. They told her, they were you have no right to even ask for your rights. You're a Dalit, why are you an activist? You don't have space to be here. They demeaned her humanity. And that is nothing new. That is how India and the Indian state treats Dalits, treats anybody who is marginalized as a minority.
Absolutely. None of this is new. It is the unfortunate reality of marginalized groups in India.
The thing is, she goes even further. She goes and she talks to more women in that jail. And the thing that she says is this, when I told them everything that I had gone through, she was they were this is normal. what she went through in like the month, a little bit over a month that she was in jail is what folks are going through every single day. Women are raped, women are beaten. She talked about how like there were folks whose hands and feet were still broken. So like there is a question, is like, where is the medical attention? Because it is definitely not there. There are folks who are being beaten every day. They're not getting medical attention. They're not healing because they're not getting medical attention. And that continuous abuse and torture is happening. And we see that with Shiv Kumar. And she also talks about there's something that's very, very important that I think to mention is that they also tried to get her to sign a forced confession that would implicate others. And we only know about this because she is now out of jail and she has been able to speak to us and do interviews. That is the only reason that we know this. But we know from other cases in history that is true. And a confession means nothing. We know that they have so many forced signed confessions. But the fact that we can say this with this much evidence, I think is very, very important to spread and to tell the whole world that this is the condition of protesters and political prisoners and prisoners in Indian jails right now.
From forced confessions to unlawful arrests, at the end of the day, the justice system is just not just. We saw this play out with Juggy's case. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Juggy is actually a Scottish citizen. He was arrested for making a website, y'all. Yes, that is it. For making a website that shared information about the atrocities that the Indian state has done. He made a website. He went to Punjab, got married, then was abducted by the police. And it has been years and he has been sitting in jail and they have put case and another case on him and he was forced to sign a confession. So I think the reason that this is so important right now is that when the state used that confession and has evidence to imprison anybody, to implicate anybody, we need to think about that.
Agreed. Taking it a step further, I believe the reason for abducting activists like Juggy, Shiv Kumar, Nodeep Kaur is to instill fear and discourage dissent. They are also not the only ones who have been abducted and are being unlawfully held and tortured by the police. There are so many names that we don't even know. It is also important to recognize that bail doesn't mean that charges have been dropped. It simply means that the individual is allowed to sleep at home instead of suffering in a jail cell. For the longest time, Shiv Kumar's case didn't even receive much attention. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because he is a Dalit labor activist. If we are going to compare it to Disha Ravi's case, like Disha Ravi, so happy she got bail, 100% she should have gotten bail. She shouldn't have even been arrested in the first place. But Shiv Kumar is a Dalit. He is living with disability. He does not have the financial means. So he doesn't have all that attention. All these other folks aren't going to go tweet and share and spread this because he is a Dalit labor act. And that's a reality. That is very much the reality in the Indian state, that if you are not a Brahmin, if you're not Hindu, if you are not conforming to Hindu nationalism, you will be picked up, you will be abducted, and you will not have justice, whatever that means in this case. And Shiv Kumar is a Dalit and he's a labor activist and his dissent is criminalized and he is seen as a threat to the state.
Absolutely. Dissent as someone who is marginalized is a risk. You touch upon a really, really important point. For those who aren't familiar with Disha Ravi, she is a climate activist who was arrested for sharing a toolkit. That's right, a toolkit that provided individuals with basic information on how to support the farmers' protest through online organizing. The toolkit was then shared on Twitter by Greta Thunberg, which meant that people all of a sudden had a way to actively support those protesting, not just read about them. This was a threat to the Indian state. So Disha Ravi was unlawfully arrested for her involvement in the toolkit. Again, you heard that right, a toolkit, which is a widely used tool to help mobilize communities, especially online. Zooming out a bit, though, if you take the case of Disha Ravi and compare it to that of Naldeep Kaur or Shiv Kumar, the layers of oppression and how they influence any individual's experience within the legal system become easily evident. We see how your experience with power is tied to where you stand in comparison or in relation to power. Another example is that of Safura Zargar, a young Muslim activist who was arrested last year for protesting the Citizenship Amendment Act, pushed by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which was Islamophobic by design and prioritized the nationalization of non-Muslim migrants over those who practice Islam.
There was so much brutality. So many Muslim activists and other activists were picked up that are still sitting in jails in India right now because they were protesting last year.
Safura's case was similar to that of Disha Ravi's, and yet the same judge denied her bail, which is why it's important to realize that none of the human rights violations we're seeing play out in India today is an anomaly. Activists continue to live under threat, and thousands are currently behind bars if they haven't already been killed. Modi has a history of genocide against minority communities. We saw this when he was the chief minister of Gujarat and allowed for the mass murder of Muslims in Gujarat. And we are seeing this again with the farmers' protest. Modi is using the farmers as a way to fabricate a quote-unquote common enemy for his majority base, essentially manufacturing a scapegoat. We saw this happen during Indira Gandhi's re-election bid when she used Sikhs as her scapegoat by painting them as terrorists to unify her voter base in the 1980s, which, as we know, led to the genocide of Sikhs in 1984. She unified a divided country against one common enemy, and we are seeing the same tactic play out again with Modi. It's the exact same playbook. We are seeing human rights violations left and right, and this is just not new.
And I think what you touched upon right now is super important. Like this happened in the 80s. And folks were picked up, folks were killed, and nobody knew where they were. Nobody knew where their loved ones were. There are folks still from the 80s, the 70s, and 90s sitting in Indian jails. And that same thing is happening now. It happened in 2002 in Gujarat. It's happened last year. It's happening now. Folks are being picked up. Folks are being abducted. They're sitting in jails. They have no access to any resources, to legal representation, their families. People don't even know where they are. And this is not new. Currently, there's hundreds of protesters missing. And there's protesters that are being killed. Like if we want to talk about Navreet Singh, who was killed by the Indian police during the protest. So the levels of this is just so intricate. It is a whole government effort to criminalize and disappear anybody who dissents.
And why criminalize dissent? Because dissent threatens power. If your end goal is to maintain and hold on to power, silencing dissent by force or by discrediting those who disagree is a tool of the ages.
To tie that to capitalism is so important because that power is, especially with the farmers' protest, that power is being held so tightly because they are afraid that if anybody finds out that their friends and Dani and Ambani, these billionaires are going to make so much more money, they know that if this unravels and the whole world will see that the only reason that these are even set up is to make more money for folks who are already rich and take resources, take land away from farmers and laborers.
Absolutely. Capitalism at its core is built on exploitation. There are a few people who hold a majority of the wealth. I've said this before, but I think it's just so important to mention that capitalism flourishes on the existence of inequities. The goal of any business operating in a capitalist society is to maximize profits for shareholders, prioritizing profits over people and the climate. Which means that businesses cut whatever corners they need to make the most profit they possibly can, even if that means turning a blind eye to exploitative labor practices. We see that happening across global and domestic supply chains. This notion essentially leaves those at the bottom, the workers, the small farmers, with only a small share of the wealth, if that. In the context of the protest, capitalism is what is driving these bills. Capitalism is what drives this need to steal land, steal generational wealth through exploitative laws that further strips away autonomy from those with less power, the small farmers, the farm workers.
Yep. And I think what you pointed out right now is so important. Like these folks are like, let's just pay them like whatever just for them to survive. If you look at why Nodeep Kaur was even protesting that day that she was abducted, was because Majdoors have been working in the pandemic for months, and the folks that own those factories, the owners of those factories, have not been paying them wages. So the reason she was out there, she's been protesting, is because laborers and Majdoors are owed back pay. And that's why she's being picked up. And that's why Nodeep Kaur, that's why Shiv Kumar, folks who are unionized, they are fighting against capitalism. If you look at it, they're fighting against privatization. They're the ones that are being picked up because they know that they're the ones that are spreading and sharing this information of how all of this connects.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. As you know, I work a lot with impact-driven brands and organizations producing products in the global south, especially India. These brands pride themselves in paying fair wages and helping fight against poverty, which is why I believe it's so important for fair trade, ethical, sustainable, purpose-driven brands and organizations to start talking about the farmers' protest. The farmers' protest is about worker rights. It's about land rights. It's about equity. It's about justice, amongst so much more. If your goal as a business is to advocate for global justice and fair living wages, then standing in solidarity with India's small farmers and farm workers is critical, because that is exactly what they are standing up for. They're advocating for themselves against a government that's built on systemic oppression, rooted in exploiting those who have historically been and continue to be marginalized. We have seen the results of an unregulated marketplace with India's garment industry, one that has been built on exploitation of workers by large international fast fashion companies. Why can a cotton t-shirt cost $5? Because everyone from the cotton farmer to garment worker are paid pennies in an effort to maximize profits for the person just above them in the production chain. When you have a free market and high competition, there's always someone who is willing to offer a lower price in order to get paid something. During COVID, it was these very workers who were hurt the most due to, and as you said, withheld wages. In the world of fast fashion, most garment factories don't see a penny from any order until after orders have been delivered. In the wake of COVID-19, big fashion brands canceled or paused orders an estimated $40 billion worth. As a result, millions of garment workers were laid off globally without pay. If we believe this is not okay, and that the system allowing for such exploitation needs to be deconstructed and rebuilt, then we cannot be okay with the bills that the farmers and farm workers across India are fighting against. It all comes back to the systems that have been built. From police brutality to wealth distribution to the hoarding of power, we see the ways in which the systems that have been built, as is the case anywhere in the world, these patriarchal systems are built to only benefit a few. So when we talk about deconstructing and rebuilding, it is important to remember that these systems are broken. The whole system needs to be reevaluated.
Just abolish the whole system.
And allowing broken systems to continue to exploit those they oppress is us being complicit. India is slated for another genocide. We see that with the countless human rights violations occurring each and every moment. But newsflash, genocide is preventable. It just requires intervention. That's why sharing content, having critical conversations, and understanding nuance is so important.
Because the more that it spreads, the more that people know, the more that these questions will be asked of the Indian state. And I think that is one of the biggest things that we can do right now.
I also want to encourage everyone to take time for self-reflection because the issues we are seeing pan out in India are not isolated to India. They exist within our local communities as well. Small farmers across the world are often exploited in food and farming systems. So take the time to reflect on where you stand in relation to power, where you stand in a system of power, and how you can use your power and privilege to really pass the mic forward to individuals who are not typically heard and typically sidelined.
And I would also, to build on that, say like organize with your local communities, organize with other folks who are marginalized by the system, organize with your Black and Brown brothers and sisters, organize with your Indigenous brothers and sisters, your siblings. That organization is what scares all of these fascist states. Us coming together and being like, hey, no, this is not okay. We're not going to stand for this. We're going to do something about it. So make sure that activism is also happening in your local communities and you're building with your local communities.
And of course, keep fighting the good fight. With that, I want to thank all the listeners for tuning into this episode of Art of Citizenry podcast and extend a special thank you to my dear friend and sister, Tharnamal, for joining me and sharing her valuable insights. If you would like to support those protesting in Delhi, please consider donating to khalsaaid.org and signing on to a solidarity statement I had the honor of co-championing with Fair World Project. You can find the link to the statement in the show notes. To learn more about Art of Citizenry and for information on future webinars and workshops, please visit artofcitizenry.com. You can also find me on Instagram at Manpreet Kalra or at Art of Citizenry. Please remember to subscribe to Art of Citizenry podcast on your favorite listening app and give us 5 stars on iTunes. From here on Duwamish land, sending positive and healthy vibes your way.